The cigarette smoke hung thick in the underground chamber beneath the Reich Chancellery, curling through the weak light like ghosts already gathering for the dead. Colonel Klaus Richter stood at attention against the concrete wall, his notebook pressed against his chest, watching the most powerful man in Europe lose his grip on reality. December 1941 had brought news that should have changed everything. The Americans were in the war now, their industrial might about to tip the scales. Outside Moscow, German soldiers were freezing in summer uniforms, their advance stopped cold by Soviet resistance and winter weather that plunged to 40 degrees below zero. The invincible Wehrmacht had met something it could not defeat: the Russian winter and the will of a people fighting for survival. Hitler paced before the map table, his left hand trembling slightly as he traced routes across the Soviet Union with fingers that seemed disconnected from the disaster unfolding in the east. Around him sat the generals who had conquered France in 6 weeks, who had rolled across Poland in days, who had believed they would take Moscow before the first snow fell. Now their faces showed the strain of men who had seen the impossible happen. General Friedrich Paulus stood nearest the map, his aristocratic features carefully neutral as he presented intelligence that everyone in the room knew Hitler did not want to hear. Soviet factories beyond the Urals were producing 3,000 tanks every month. The Red Army had reserves no one had anticipated. Every estimate of Soviet strength had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. Richter had been appointed to document these secret strategy sessions, a duty he had initially considered an honor. Now, 6 months into the Russian campaign, he understood it was a curse. He watched Hitler's face flush red as Paulus laid out the numbers, watched the Führer's jaw clench when the general suggested the 1942 summer offensive needed to concentrate forces for a single decisive objective. The professional military advice was clear and unanimous. Germany could not fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. Resources were finite. Manpower was not infinite. Basic military doctrine demanded concentration of force at the critical point. Hitler listened to none of it. The decision came suddenly, explosively, with Hitler slamming his hand on the map hard enough to make the markers jump. Army Group South would split into 2 separate thrusts next summer. Army Group A would drive southeast toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, the lifeblood Germany desperately needed for its mechanized war machine. Army Group B would simultaneously drive east to Stalingrad, the industrial city on the Volga River that bore Stalin's name. 2 objectives, hundreds of miles apart, splitting the Wehrmacht's strength at the exact moment it needed to concentrate. Every general in the room knew it violated the most basic principles of warfare. None spoke. Richter felt the weight of the moment press down on him like the tons of concrete above their heads. He had studied military history at the academy, had read Clausewitz and von Moltke, understood that dividing forces before the enemy invited defeat in detail. Yet here, in this smoke-filled room, strategy was being rewritten by intuition and ideology. Hitler spoke of destiny and willpower, of the Aryan spirit that would triumph over Slavic hordes, of his infallible instinct that had been proven right in Poland and France and the Balkans. He spoke of everything except logistics, except supply lines stretching across 1,000 miles of hostile territory, except the reality that the Soviet Union was not collapsing but growing stronger. General Paulus tried once more, his voice carefully respectful but urgent. The Sixth Army could take one objective or the other, but attempting both simultaneously would leave them vulnerable. The flanks would have to be held by allied Romanian and Italian armies with inferior equipment and training. If the Soviets counterattacked those weak points, the entire offensive could be endangered. Hitler's response was cold fury barely contained. He questioned Paulus's loyalty, his courage, his understanding of the new warfare that German genius had created. The general fell silent, his face pale in the harsh electric light. The other officers studied their hands, their maps, the walls, anything but the trembling man before them. Richter wrote it all down in his careful script, documenting the moment when the war's outcome was sealed. He noted the date, the officers present, the decision made. Later, Alone in his quarters in the early morning darkness, he would add his own thoughts to the secret journal he kept locked in his footlocker. But here now, he could only watch and record as Hitler dismissed the generals with a wave of his hand. The orders would be drafted, the plans set in motion, the great offensive prepared for the spring thaw. Stalingrad and the Caucasus both, simultaneously, splitting German strength across the vast Russian steppe. As the generals filed out, Paulus paused beside Richter for just a moment. Their eyes met, and in that brief glance, the colonel saw everything the general could not say. Fear, resignation, professional horror at the decision just made. Then Paulus was gone, climbing the stairs back to the world above, where the German people still believed in certain victory. Richter remained in the shadow room a moment longer, breathing the stale air, feeling history's weight. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote a single line that captured everything he had witnessed. Today we chose defeat, but no one will know until the snow falls red. Then he closed the book, turned off the light, and followed the generals up into the winter night where Berlin slept, unaware that its fate had just been sealed in a hidden room beneath the earth. The steppes stretched endlessly in every direction under the merciless August sun, shimmering with heat that turned the horizon into liquid mirages. Lieutenant Peter Steiner sat in the back of the transport truck, dust coating his face and uniform, watching Germany's great summer offensive roll eastward in a river of steel and flesh. Operation Blue had begun in late June 1942, and for 6 weeks the Wehrmacht had driven deep into Soviet territory, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, seizing vast territories, pushing toward the oil fields that would fuel the Reich's war machine. Yet something felt wrong to Steiner, something he could not name, but could sense in the tired faces of the veterans around him, in the way supply convoys seemed thinner than they should be, in the growing distances between units as the offensive spread across the southern Soviet Union like butter scraped too thin across bread. His company had started the war with 140 men. Now, after a year in Russia, they numbered 63. The replacements were younger each time, boys of 17 and 18 with smooth faces and eyes that had not yet learned what death looked like. Steiner was 24 and felt ancient. He touched the letters from his wife Maria in his breast pocket, her words about their son learning to walk, about life in Hamburg that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Here there was only dust and heat and the constant grinding advance towards Stalingrad, the city that had become Hitler's obsession for reasons that had nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with the name it bore. The Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Colonel Richter stood before another map, watching another argument he could not influence. The great offensive was fracturing exactly as the generals had warned. Army Group A had driven south toward the Caucasus oil fields but was now bogged down in the mountains, their advance slowing against stiffening Soviet resistance. Army Group B, with Paulus's 6th Army as its spearhead, was approaching Stalingrad but had been weakened by constant detachment of units to support the southern drive. Hitler had created 2 separate campaigns where he needed one concentrated blow, and now both objectives were slipping from his grasp. Worse, the flanks of the Stalingrad thrust were held by Romanian 3rd Army to the northwest and Romanian 4th Army to the south, Allied troops with World War I-era equipment facing a Soviet Union that was learning, adapting, building strength. The intelligence reports crossing Richter's desk told a story that no one at headquarters wanted to hear. Soviet factories were producing 7 tanks for every one Germany built. Their T-34 medium tank was superior to anything the Wehrmacht fielded in comparable numbers. The Red Army was no longer the disorganized force of 1941, retreating in panic and surrendering by the millions. They were learning German tactics, implementing deep defensive positions, husbanding their strength for counteroffensives. Most critically, Soviet reconnaissance had detected massive concentrations of forces north and south of Stalingrad, precisely where the weak Romanian armies held the line. Richter brought these reports to every briefing, laid them on the map table in front of Hitler and the High Command, and watched them be dismissed as defeatist propaganda. In Stalingrad, Steiner experienced urban warfare for the first time and understood immediately that this was different from anything his training had prepared him for. The city was not a place, but a maze of ruins, every building a fortress, every room a potential tomb. His company fought for 3 days to capture a single apartment block, only to discover Soviet soldiers had tunneled through the basement and reoccupied it behind them during the night. They fought in sewers and subway tunnels, across factory floors and through grain elevators, in a grinding house-to-house battle where progress was measured in meters and paid for in lives. The Soviets had a saying they shouted from the ruins: "There is no land for us beyond the Volga." They fought with the desperation of men and women defending their final line. September became October, and the weather began to turn. Paulus's Sixth Army had pushed into the city and controlled most of it, but the cost had been staggering. German casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. Units that had started the summer at full strength were now skeleton crews of exhausted men. Ammunition ran low, then critically low. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles across territory where Soviet partisans operated with increasing boldness. Yet Hitler demanded the city be taken completely, every last block, every last building. When Paulus requested permission to pause the offensive, to consolidate positions and build defensive flanks, the answer from the Wolf's Lair was always the same: attack. Take the city. Accept no excuses. Richter traveled to the front in October as a liaison officer, carrying orders from Hitler that made experienced commanders' faces go pale. He spent 3 days at Sixth Army headquarters, saw the maps showing the dangerous gaps in the lines, the overextended positions, the thin screening forces trying to protect flanks that stretched over 100 kilometers. He spoke with intelligence officers who showed him aerial reconnaissance of Soviet forces massing to the north and south, exactly where common sense said they would attack. Back at Paulus's command post, the general looked 10 years older than he had in that Berlin shadow room. The confident professional had become a haunted man trapped between his duty to his soldiers and his oath to the Führer. But on November 3rd, Richter attended another secret conference call between Paulus and the high command. The general's request was simple and desperate. Soviet forces were clearly preparing for an encirclement. The flanks were vulnerable. He needed permission to withdraw to more defensible positions, or at least to pull back reserves to strengthen the threatened sectors. Hitler's response came through Field Marshal Keitel with absolute clarity. The Sixth Army would hold every meter of ground taken. There would be no retreat, no repositioning, no acknowledgement of danger. Stalingrad must be held for political reasons, for the symbolism of Stalin's city falling to German arms. Military reality had become irrelevant. Richter returned to his quarters that night and wrote in his journal with hands that shook slightly. He described the map he had seen, the obvious Soviet preparations, the inadequate German reserves, the refusal to acknowledge reality. He wrote about the disconnect between what headquarters believed and what existed on the ground, between Hitler's map in East Prussia and the frozen earth around Stalingrad. He ended the entry with a single observation that kept him awake through the night. The Führer fights the war he imagines, not the war that exists. And soon, very soon, imagination will meet reality. The first snow began falling the next morning, light flakes that melted on contact. Within days, it would become the blizzard that covered the steppe in white. And somewhere in that whiteness, Soviet armies were moving into position, preparing to spring the trap that everyone except Hitler could see closing. The Soviet artillery barrage began at 7:30 in the morning on November 19th, 1942, and the sound was like the earth itself splitting open. Lieutenant Steiner, huddled in a basement command post 3 kilometers inside Stalingrad's ruins, felt the concussions through the concrete walls and knew immediately that something catastrophic was happening to the north. The bombardment was unlike anything he had experienced. Thousands of guns firing simultaneously in a preparation that turned the Romanian positions along the Don River into a lunar landscape of craters and shattered bodies. Within hours, radio communications from 3rd Romanian Army dissolved into screaming chaos, then static, then nothing at all. Soviet tank armies had smashed through the defenders like a fist through paper, and now they were racing south behind Stalingrad, behind the Sixth Army, behind everything. The next day brought the second hammer blow. Fourth Romanian Army south of Stalingrad collapsed under identical assault, and Soviet mechanized forces drove north to meet their counterparts. On November 23rd, 5 days after Operation Uranus began, the pincers closed at Kalach on the Don River. The Sixth Army, 20 German divisions and portions of 2 Romanian divisions, over 250,000 men, was surrounded in a pocket roughly 30 miles wide and 20 miles deep. Paulus immediately requested permission to break out toward the southwest where the Soviet ring was thinnest. The response from Hitler, relayed through high command, was unequivocal. The Sixth Army would hold its positions. Hermann Göring had personally guaranteed that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air. Relief forces were being organized. The city would not be abandoned. Colonel Richter stood in the operations room at the Wolf's Lair when Göring made his impossible promise, and the look on the professional officers' faces told him everything. Supplying a surrounded army of that size required delivering 700 tons of supplies daily by air. The Luftwaffe had never achieved anything close to that capacity. The distances were too great, the weather was worsening, the Soviet air defenses were growing stronger by the day. Yet Göring, desperate to regain Hitler's favor after the Luftwaffe's failures in the Battle of Britain, promised the impossible, and Hitler chose to believe him because the alternative meant admitting the catastrophic mistake that Richter had watched being made in that underground room nearly a year ago. Inside the pocket, reality arrived much faster than supplies. Steiner's company, already exhausted from months of urban combat, now faced a new enemy that could not be shot or outmaneuvered. The cold came first, temperatures plunging to 20 below zero, while German soldiers still wore autumn uniforms. Frostbite claimed more men than Soviet attacks in those first weeks. Then came hunger. The promised airlift delivered perhaps 70 tons on good days, a tenth of what was needed. Rations were cut in half, then cut again. The horses were slaughtered and eaten, every last one, until no transport remained for artillery or supplies. Men began to move slowly, conserving energy, their faces taking on the hollow look of starvation. That be why mid-December, Steiner's company had lost 20 men to hunger and cold without firing a shot. They occupied a destroyed factory on the edge of the pocket's perimeter, taking turns at watch while others huddled around fires made from furniture and roof beams. He wrote letters to Maria, knowing they would never be sent, describing things he could not bear to keep inside his mind. How Corporal Schmidt had died in his sleep from hypothermia despite being surrounded by other men. How Private Lehman had lost all 10 toes to frostbite and could no longer walk. How the youngest soldier, barely 18, had simply stopped speaking one day and stared at nothing with eyes that had given up. Steiner wrote these things in careful script, then folded the letters and kept them in his breast pocket next to Maria's photograph, talismans against the madness. The relief attempt came in December. Field Marshal Manstein's hastily assembled army group dawned driving northeast toward the pocket in Operation Winterstorm. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Richter, traveling with Manstein's headquarters, watched the relief force fight to within 30 miles of the pocket, close enough that Sixth Army could hear the artillery. If Paulus broke out simultaneously, many could be saved. The general sent urgent requests to Hitler for permission to abandon Stalingrad and fight toward the relief force. On December 23rd, in another midnight conference that Richter documented with growing horror, Hitler refused. Stalingrad must be held. The city was too symbolically important. The Sixth Army would wait for relief to reach them, not abandon their positions that Manstein's offensive stalled, then was forced to retreat as Soviet reserve counterattacked. The narrow window closed. The pocket remained sealed. Inside, men began to understand they had been abandoned not through military necessity, but through one man's refusal to admit his strategy had failed. Steiner watched soldiers' faces change in late December, saw the moment when hope died and was replaced by something colder and more terrible. They had been expendable all along, sacrifices to pride and ideology. The Sixth Army had become a demonstration of will rather than a military force. Their suffering and death transformed into a political statement about German determination. January brought temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero, and Soviet attacks designed not to destroy the pocket quickly, but to compress it slowly, grinding down resistance through constant pressure. The Luftwaffe airlift became increasingly sporadic as Soviet fighters dominated the skies. Some days, no planes arrived at all. Soldiers ate boot, leather boiled into soup, chewed on belts and harnesses, consumed anything that might provide calories. Typhus appeared, then dysentery, diseases of malnourishment and poor sanitation that spread through the crowded positions like fire through dry grass. Steiner's company, which had numbered 63 men in August, was down to 19 by mid-January, and most of those were barely able to stand it on January 8th. Soviet forces offered surrender terms. Fight to the last man, or lay down arms and receive treatment as prisoners of war according to international conventions. Paulus forwarded the offer to Hitler and requested permission to negotiate. The response was promotion to field marshal and a reminder that no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear. Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than give up, to follow the example of military honor as the Führer defined it. But Paulus was no longer the confident general who had stood in that Berlin shadow room. He was a broken man watching his army die by inches, and he was tired of following orders that served no purpose except prolonging agony. Steiner wrote his final letter to Maria on January 27th, his handwriting nearly illegible from weakness and cold. He told her about their son, about the life he had hoped to live after the war, about the man he had tried to be despite everything. He told her not to hate him if he did what he must to survive, even if survival meant surrender and imprisonment. He told her the truth that would never appear in any official German communique. They had been betrayed not by their courage or their comrades, but by the man who had promised them victory and delivered them into this frozen hell for reasons that had nothing to do with military sense. He sealed the letter, placed it in his breast pocket, and waited for the end that was now just days away. The surrender came in pieces, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a slow disintegration of will and capacity to resist. Paulus capitulated on January 31st, 1943, in the southern pocket of what remained of Stalingrad, and the last German resistance in the northern pocket ended on February 2nd. Of the 250,000 men trapped in the encirclement, barely 90,000 remained alive to march into Soviet captivity. The rest lay frozen in the ruins, buried under snow that would not melt until spring revealed the true scale of the catastrophe. Lieutenant Peter Steiner was among the survivors, though survival was perhaps too generous a word for what he had become. The march into captivity began in the first week of February. Thousands of skeletal figures in torn uniforms stumbling through snow under guard by Soviet soldiers who looked at them with something between pity and contempt. Steiner could barely walk, his body consuming itself to stay alive, every step an act of will against muscles that wanted to quit. Around him, men simply stopped moving and fell, too weak to continue, dying in the snow where they dropped. The Soviet guards did not stop the column for the fallen. There were too many, and the living needed to reach the POW camps before they joined the dead. Steiner had lost 30 kilograms since August, his uniform hanging on a frame that resembled a skeleton more than a man. The letter to Maria remained in his breast pocket, but his hands were too numb and swollen with frostbite to remove it. The camp they reached after a week of marching was little more than a fenced enclosure with a few wooden barracks that could hold perhaps a tenth of the prisoners. The rest huddled in the open, exposed to wind that cut like razors. Dysentery spread through the crowded conditions within days, claiming men who had survived the battle and the march. Steiner developed a fever that made everything seem distant and unreal, his mind floating somewhere above his failing body. On February 18th, in a barack that smelled of death and human waste, he closed his eyes during the night and did not open them again. The letter in his pocket, the final words to Maria, was taken by a fellow prisoner who promised to deliver it if he ever reached Germany. That prisoner died 3 weeks later in another camp. The letter was lost, like so many voices, like so many stories that would never be told. General Paulus survived the initial captivity, his rank affording him marginally better treatment than the enlisted men dying by thousands in the camps. The Soviets saw propaganda value in the field marshal who had commanded at Stalingrad, and they were patient in their cultivation. For months, Paulus refused to speak against Hitler or the regime, clinging to the professional soldier's code of honor, even after everything that code had cost his army. But isolation, despair, and the gradual realization of what his obedience had enabled eventually broke something fundamental in him. In September 1943, he agreed to join the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German prisoners who broadcast appeals to Wehrmacht soldiers to surrender. Paulus's voice, weak and uncertain at first, spoke over Soviet radio about the futility of continued resistance, about the criminal leadership that had sacrificed Sixth Army for pride and politics. He urged German soldiers to lay down their arms, to recognize that Hitler was leading Germany to total destruction. The transformation from loyal officer to reluctant collaborator was painful and incomplete. Paulus never fully reconciled what he had become with what he believed himself to be, spending the rest of his captivity in a moral limbo between duty and survival. He would not return to Germany until 1953, and when he did, he would find himself despised by former comrades as a traitor, regardless of the impossible position into which he had been placed. Colonel Klaus Richter returned to Berlin in March 1943, officially tasked with documenting lessons learned from the Stalingrad disaster for future operations. Unofficially, he understood his role was to help craft the narrative that would explain to the German people how an entire army had been lost. The official story blamed Soviet numbers, the weather, the failures of Allied armies, everything except the fundamental strategic decisions that Richter had documented in his secret journals. He attended meetings where lies were constructed with the same attention to detail that proper strategy should have received, watched as Stalingrad was transformed from a preventable catastrophe into an inevitable tragedy of heroic proportions. Through 1943 and into 1944, Richter continued documenting the pattern he had first recognized in that underground room in December 1941. Hitler refused to allow strategic retreats from any position, demanding fanatical stands that accomplished nothing except multiplying casualties. In North Africa, 250,000 more men were lost when Tunisia was held too long and then surrounded. In Italy, the defense consumed armies in grinding battles for symbolic towns. On the Eastern Front, city after city was declared a fortress that must be held to the last man, creating dozens of smaller Stalingrads that bled the Wehrmacht white. Richter watched professional soldiers like Manstein and Guderian offer sound strategic advice and then be dismissed or relieved when they persisted. The hidden war was not against the Allies, but against military reality itself. Richter's journals grew to fill 3 volumes. Careful documentation of meetings, decisions, intelligence reports that were ignored, and advice that was rejected. He wrote not for immediate publication, understanding that such documents would mean his execution, but for history. Someone needed to record how this had happened, how professional military judgment had been subordinated to one man's ego and ideology, how an entire nation had been led into disaster by leadership that could not admit error. He developed an elaborate system of hiding the journals, moving them between locations, trusting only a select few with knowledge of their existence. WY April 1945. Soviet armies were in Berlin, and the Reich was dying in fire and rubble. Richter, now a hollow-eyed shadow of the officer who had stood in that shadow room 40 months earlier, made his final preparations. He placed his journals, along with maps, meeting notes, and intelligence reports, into a sealed metal container designed to survive fire and explosion. In the cellar of a half-destroyed building in the government district, he buried the container under debris and marked the location on a map that he kept on his person. If he died, perhaps someone would find the map. If he survived, he would retrieve the documents when peace came. He never got the chance. The final Soviet assault on the Reich Chancellery sector came on April 30th. Richter, drafted into the desperate defense despite his staff position, died in the rubble of Wilhelmstrasse with a rifle in his hands and a location map in his pocket. His body was never identified among the thousands of dead. The building where he had buried his testimony took a direct hit from Soviet artillery 2 days later, collapsing entirely. For 2 years, his final act seemed to have been for nothing. His carefully preserved truth buried under tons of concrete and earth in a city that had become a graveyard. In September 1947, a Soviet engineering team clearing rubble for reconstruction found the metal container crushed but intact. Inside, protected from fire and water and time, were Richter's journals and documents. The Soviets photographed everything, interested in evidence of German military thinking, then forwarded the originals to their military intelligence archives. Eventually, through channels that remained classified for decades, portions of the documents reached Western historians. The complete collection would not be fully published until after the Cold War ended, but fragments began appearing in scholarly works in the 1960s, providing an insider's perspective on how catastrophic decisions were made. The journals described the December 1941 meeting where Hitler decided to split his forces against all military advice, creating the conditions for Stalingrad. They documented how warnings of Soviet buildup were dismissed, how requests to withdraw or strengthen flanks were refused, how Göring's impossible promises were accepted over logistical reality. They showed in careful detail how a military disaster was not an accident or a result of enemy superiority, but the inevitable outcome of leadership that valued willpower over competence, ideology over strategy, and pride over the lives of soldiers. Richter's final entry, written in April 1945, captured everything. We chose defeat that winter day in 1941, but it took 4 more years and millions more dead before the choice could no longer be denied. I pray these words survive to tell that truth, that some of us knew, that some of us tried to preserve the record, even when we could not change the outcome. Those words, buried under Berlin's ruins and recovered by chance, became testimony to how wars are lost not just on battlefields, but in hidden rooms where truth is unwelcome and dissent is dangerous, where decisions made in secrecy reshape history in ways their makers never intended to reveal.